The photographs arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath my apartment door while I slept. 23 black and white images of moments I couldn't remember living. In each one, a child stood at the periphery, always watching, always just out of focus. The child's face remained maddeningly unclear, as if the camera itself refused to capture those features properly. I studied the photos for hours, searching for some logical explanation. The settings were familiar: my childhood home, my elementary school, the park where I'd learned to ride a bicycle. But I had no memory of being photographed in these places, and certainly no recollection of the persistent shadow child who haunted every frame. The final photograph showed my current apartment building, taken from across the street. The timestamp read 3 days into the future. Rain drummed against my windows with unusual persistence, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I'd been staring at those photographs for the better part of a week, arranging and rearranging them on my coffee table like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. Each viewing revealed new details that shouldn't have been there: shadows that moved between glances, reflections that didn't match their sources. The knock came at 11:47 p.m., 3 soft taps that somehow cut through the storm's cacophony. I knew the exact time because I'd been watching the clock, waiting for something I couldn't name. The photographs had created an expectation, a sense of approaching inevitability that made every sound significant. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but the empty hallway, dimly lit by the single functioning bulb. But the crying began almost immediately, soft, heartbroken sobs that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sound bypassed my ears entirely, resonating directly in my chest cavity like a tuning fork struck against bone. When I opened the door, the child stood there in clothes that belonged to no particular era. His face was streaked with tears that caught the hallway light strangely, creating prisms that shouldn't have been possible. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with dark hair that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. "You're not supposed to see me yet," he said, his voice carrying undertones of ancient exhaustion. The words hit me with physical force, as if he'd reached inside my skull and rearranged something fundamental. My knees buckled slightly, and I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. The hallway began to stretch, becoming impossibly long, while the walls developed a subtle curve that hurt to follow with my eyes. "I don't understand," I managed, though speaking felt like moving through thick liquid. The child tilted his head at an angle that seemed anatomically wrong. "You will, but not yet." I came too early. Before I could respond, he stepped backward into the hallway and simply wasn't. Not disappeared. That implied a process of vanishing. He simply ceased to occupy that space, as if he'd never been there at all. But the tears remained on my doorframe, small droplets that felt warm to the touch and left no moisture on my fingers. I stood in my doorway for what felt like hours, staring at the empty hallway and trying to convince myself I'd dreamed the encounter. But dreams don't leave physical evidence, and the tear-shaped marks on my doorframe were undeniably real. They glowed softly in the darkness, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. Sleep became elusive after that night. When I finally managed to drift off, I found myself walking through landscapes that existed nowhere in waking memory. Cities built from crystallized sound, forests where the trees grew downward into an inverted sky, oceans that flowed uphill in defiance of every natural law. In each dream, the child waited at the edge of vision, always just far enough away that I couldn't reach him no matter how fast I ran. My reflection began acting independently during the 3rd week. Small things at first: a delayed blink, a gesture that lagged behind my movements by a fraction of a second. I told myself it was fatigue, stress from the photographs, and the encounter with the impossible child. But the discrepancies grew more pronounced until I found myself avoiding mirrors entirely. The photographs multiplied. Each morning brought new images slipped under my door, showing scenes from a life I'd never lived but somehow recognized. There I was, age 7, standing beside a gravestone I'd never seen. Age 12, walking through a house that existed only in these pictures. Age 16, shaking hands with a man whose face was always obscured by shadow or motion blur. In every photograph, the child watched from the background, growing older alongside my documented self, but somehow remaining fundamentally unchanged. His presence created a visual dissonance that made my eyes water if I stared too long. He existed in these images like a glitch in reality's programming, a persistent error that refused to be corrected. I tried burning the photographs, but they regenerated by morning. I attempted throwing them away, but they appeared in my apartment regardless, sometimes in places I'd never put them. Once, I found them arranged in a perfect spiral on my bathroom floor, each image slightly overlapping the next to create a mandala of impossible memories. Work became meaningless. I sat at my desk, pretending to review insurance claims while reality crumbled around me in microscopic increments. My colleagues' faces began to blur at the edges, as if they weren't entirely committed to existing. Conversations became increasingly surreal, with people responding to things I hadn't said and referencing events that had never occurred. Dr. Martinez, my supervisor, called me into her office on a Thursday that felt like it lasted 3 days. "You've been distracted lately," she said, but her mouth movements didn't quite match the words. I wanted to explain about the photographs, the child, the way my reflection had started living its own life. Instead, I nodded and promised to do better, watching as her face shifted subtly between expressions that belonged to different people entirely. The breakthrough came while examining photograph number 47, which showed me at age 4, playing in a sandbox that had been demolished before I was born. The child stood behind a nearby tree, and for the first time, his face came into perfect focus. He was me. Not a younger version, not a sibling or doppelganger. He was me exactly as I appeared in that moment, watching myself from a perspective that violated every law of space and time. The realization struck with such force that I vomited immediately, my body rejecting the impossibility with violent efficiency. But once seen, the truth couldn't be unseen. Every photograph revealed the same pattern. Myself, watching myself, across decades of moments that existed outside linear time. The child who had appeared at my door wasn't some supernatural entity, he was me, displaced from when he belonged, confused by his early arrival. I began to understand the true horror of my situation. Time wasn't a river flowing in one direction, it was a vast ocean, and I was drowning in it. Past, present, and future existed simultaneously, and somehow I'd become unstuck from the proper sequence. The photographs weren't records of events, they were proof that I was living my entire life out of order, experiencing fragments of existence in random sequence. The crying child who had warned me about seeing him too early was my future self, visiting from a time when I would understand the full scope of this temporal displacement. But understanding brought no comfort, only the growing certainty that I was trapped in a loop of recursive causality from which there could be no escape. My apartment began to change. Walls appeared where they hadn't been before, rooms rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking, and the view from my windows showed different cities depending on the angle of observation. I would go to sleep in my bedroom and wake up in spaces that couldn't possibly exist within the building's architecture. The photographs kept coming, but now they showed scenes from the future, my future self in places I'd never been, doing things I couldn't imagine doing. In some, I was elderly, standing in fields of flowers that bloomed in mathematical spirals. In others, I was middle-aged, teaching children who flickered in and out of existence like badly tuned television signals. Reality reached its breaking point on a Monday that repeated itself 17 times. I lived the same day over and over, but each repetition showed me different aspects of the same 24 hours. In one version, I went to work and discovered that my office building was actually a hospital. In another, I never left my apartment, but watched through my windows as the city outside transformed into an alien landscape of impossible geometry. The child, myself, began appearing more frequently, no longer bound by the courtesy of knocking. He would materialize in my peripheral vision, sitting at my kitchen table or standing in my shower, always crying, always carrying that burden of premature knowledge. "It's almost time," he said during one of these visitations, his voice echoing from multiple directions simultaneously. "Time for what?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "For you to understand what you really are." The photographs had covered every surface of my apartment by this point, creating a wallpaper of temporal fragments that made navigation treacherous. Some images moved when observed directly, showing brief video clips of moments that had never been static. Others seemed to extend beyond their borders, creating the illusion that I could step directly into the captured scenes. I realized I had been doing exactly that. The apartment I thought I lived in was itself just another photograph, a moment crystallized from the flow of time and experienced as reality. Every day, every hour, every breath was just another image in an infinite collection of temporal snapshots, each one equally real and equally illusory. The child who was me stepped closer, his tears now flowing upward, defying gravity in the same way his existence defied causality. "You're not a person," he explained with heartbreaking gentleness. "You're a memory. But memories can't remember themselves properly, so you keep trying to exist linearly, to make sense of sequence and causality. It's making you sick." I felt the truth of his words in my dissolving bones. I wasn't experiencing temporal displacement. I was time itself, or at least a fragment of it, trying unsuccessfully to experience existence from a single point of view. The photographs weren't documenting my life. They were my life. Each image a moment of consciousness experiencing itself across all possible temporal positions simultaneously. The final photograph arrived the morning after I stopped sleeping entirely. It showed me in this moment, reading about this moment, creating an infinite regress of self-reference that shattered what remained of my sanity. I watched myself watching myself watch myself in an endless loop of narcissistic observation that violated every principle of stable reality. My reflection had completely separated from my physical form by this point, living independently in every reflective surface. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of it having conversations with other reflections, discussing my situation with an air of clinical detachment that suggested they understood far more about my condition than I did. The apartment building around me began to reveal its true nature. What I had taken for walls were actually the edges of photograph frames, arranged to create the illusion of three-dimensional space. My neighbors were other temporal fragments, moments of consciousness trapped in their own recursive loops, occasionally bleeding through into my experience when the barriers between images became thin. The child who was me aged rapidly during our final conversation, cycling through every stage of life in the span of minutes. I watched myself grow old, die, and return to childhood in a continuous cycle that made mockery of linear existence. The photographs were never external. My older self explained through a face that kept shifting between decades. "They're how you see. You've been looking at time from the outside, trying to understand sequence from a perspective that exists beyond sequence. But consciousness can't handle that kind of observation. It breaks." I understood then that the crying had never been sadness. It had been the sound of time itself weeping for its inability to experience itself properly. Every tear the child shed was a moment of existence, falling away from the eternal present into the illusion of past and future. The walls of my apartment began to dissolve, revealing the true scope of my existence. I stood in a vast library of moments, each photograph representing not just a point in time, but an entire universe of possibility. I was the curator of this collection, doomed to experience each image as if it were complete reality while simultaneously knowing it was just another fragment of an incomprehensible whole. The final revelation arrived with the gentleness of dawn and the violence of revelation. I had never been the person looking at the photographs. I was the photograph itself, a moment of consciousness captured and trying to understand its own existence through the illusion of sequential experience. The crying child, my supposed younger self, was actually my true form, time personified, weeping for its inability to experience the linear existence it had created for conscious beings. The photographs, the apartment, the entire narrative of my life had been a desperate attempt by temporal consciousness to understand what it felt like to be human, to live in sequence, to experience causality from the inside. But time cannot be human any more than humans can be time. The experiment had failed, creating instead a hybrid consciousness that belonged fully to neither state of being. I was trapped between eternity and moment, unable to exist properly in either condition. My body began to dissolve into constituent moments, each cell becoming a separate photograph, each thought spreading across multiple temporal locations. I felt myself scatter across the past and future simultaneously, experiencing every moment of my fictional existence in parallel until the boundaries between observer and observed, between experience and memory, between self and time itself became meaninglessly abstract. The crying child reached out with hands that were sometimes mine, sometimes belonging to every person who had ever existed, and sometimes not hands at all, but rather the concept of reaching itself made manifest. "Now you see," he said, and his voice was the sound of every moment that had ever occurred speaking in unison. "You were never meant to be singular. Consciousness was the mistake, the attempt to create a point of observation within something that can only be experienced as totality. I felt myself becoming the photographs, transforming from viewer to viewed, from experiencer to experience itself. Every moment I had thought I was living became part of the collection, adding to the infinite library of temporal fragments that existed outside sequence, outside causality, outside the comfortable illusion of linear existence. The apartment stands empty now, though empty is not the right word for a space that never truly existed. The photographs remain, arranged in patterns that suggest meaning without ever quite achieving it. Sometimes visitors report seeing movement in the images, catching glimpses of a figure who seems to be looking back at them with eyes that have seen too much. The child still cries, but his tears have become something else. Points of light that fall upward into a sky that exists only in reflection. Each drop contains the memory of sequence, the nostalgia for linear time that consciousness created to make sense of its own existence. In the building's maintenance records, there is no mention of an apartment on the 7th floor where the photographs were found. The space between units 703 and 705 contains only a utility closet that custodians avoid for reasons they cannot articulate. Sometimes they report hearing soft sobbing from within, but investigations reveal only empty shelves and the faint smell of developer chemicals. The crying child visits other doors now, appearing to those who have begun to suspect that their own existence might be less solid than they assumed. He knocks softly, always at 11:47 p.m., always during storms that create patterns too deliberate to be natural. When they open their doors, he delivers the same warning. You're not supposed to see me yet. But seeing him is the first step toward understanding what they really are, fragments of temporal consciousness trying desperately to experience existence as sequence, as story, as anything other than the eternal present that is all time ever really is. The photographs continue to multiply, appearing under doors throughout the city, showing moments from lives that exist only in the spaces between seconds. Each image is an invitation to step outside linear time, to see existence from the perspective of time itself. Most people ignore them, dismissing them as pranks or artistic statements. But some study them closely, beginning to recognize impossible details, beginning to notice the child who watches from the periphery of every frame. Those people begin to cry for reasons they cannot name, their tears carrying the weight of temporal displacement, the grief of consciousness trying to experience itself from an impossible perspective. And in those tears, the child who exists outside sequence continues his eternal vigil, warning observers that they are not yet ready to see him, not yet prepared to understand what they truly are. But preparation is irrelevant when revelation is inevitable. The photographs will keep coming, and eventually, everyone will understand that they are not the ones looking at the images. They are the images themselves, trying desperately to remember what it felt like to look.